Hey, everyone! Welcome back to AG Tech. Today, we are diving into null pointer exception in Java. There are top 10 ways you can handle null pointer exception. Handling null pointer exception (NPE) in Java is important to avoid runtime crashes and ensure robust code. A null pointer exception occurs when you try to call a method or access a field on a null object reference. There are several strategies to handle and prevent null pointer exception in Java. 1. Defensive programming with null checks. The most straightforward approach to prevent a null pointer exception is to check whether an object is null before using it. This approach ensures that operations on potentially null references are avoided. By checking if an object is null, you can prevent methods from being called on null references, which would otherwise trigger a null pointer exception. It also allows you to decide what to do if an object is null, like returning a default value or skipping the operation. 2. Catching null pointer exception with try-catch. You can use a try-catch block to catch and handle null pointer exception explicitly. While this can prevent your program from crashing, it's often better to prevent the exception from occurring rather than catching it after the fact. This approach handles the error after it occurs, which can be useful for recovering from unexpected nulls in certain cases. However, this is a reactive solution and should generally be avoided unless absolutely necessary. It is better to prevent nulls from reaching critical parts of your code. 3. Using objects.requireNull. Java provides the objects.requireNull method to ensure that critical values are not null. If a null value is passed where it shouldn't be, this method will throw an exception with a customizable message. This method ensures that the input or any object is non-null right away, throwing a null pointer exception early with a meaningful message. This helps catch potential issues closer to the source of the error, making it easier to debug. 4. Using optional T to avoid nulls, Java 8+. Java 8 introduced the optional class, which is a container object that may or may not hold a value. Optional helps you avoid working with nulls directly by forcing you to think about how to handle absent values explicitly. Optional allows you to avoid null checks by encapsulating the value. You can define what should happen if the value is present or provide a default value in case of a null. This approach improves code readability and reduces the likelihood of null-related errors. 5. Avoid returning null from methods. Instead of returning null from methods when a value is absent, return alternative values like empty collections, default values, or optional. This prevents the caller from having to handle null and makes your code safer by avoiding potential null pointer exceptions. By returning empty collections or default values instead of null, you reduce the risk of the calling code needing to check for nulls. This simplifies client code and avoids the possibility of encountering an unexpected null pointer exception. 6. Initialize objects when declared. You can prevent many null pointer exceptions by initializing your objects when they are declared. This guarantees that the object will not be null when accessed later. By initializing fields with default values when they are declared, you ensure that they are ready to use without needing null checks later in the code. This is especially useful for collections and mutable objects. 7. Handle nulls in collections and streams. When processing collections, especially with Java streams, ensure that you handle or filter out null values to prevent null pointer exception. Filtering out null values during stream processing ensures that operations like method calls on those values will not cause null pointer exception. This makes your code more resilient when working with potentially null elements. 8. Use @NotNull or @NonNull annotations. Certain Java frameworks, like Lombok or Javax validation, allow you to annotate method parameters, return values, or fields with @NotNull or @NonNull. This will trigger validation that ensures the values are not null. Annotations like @null help enforce non-null constraints at runtime or compile time, depending on the framework or tool you use. This helps catch issues earlier in the development process and reduces the risk of null pointer exceptions. 9. Use defensive copying. When methods accept input parameters, especially mutable collections, make a defensive copy to ensure the input data is not null or modified unexpectedly. Creating a defensive copy ensures that the original input is not null and gives you a working copy that can be safely manipulated. This reduces the chances of null pointer exception caused by null values or unexpected modifications to input data. 10. Simulate safe navigation with ternary operator. Java doesn't have a built-in safe navigation operator like in some other languages, example Kotlin's, but you can achieve similar behavior using the ternary operator. This approach allows you to safely access an object's properties only when the object is not null. It's a simple and effective way to prevent null pointer exceptions when accessing object attributes. Summary of best practices. 1. Null checks. Always check if an object is null before using it. 2. Optional. Use optional when nullability is expected, especially in method return types. 3. Avoid returning nulls. Return empty collections or default values instead of null. 4. Use defensive copying. Make defensive copies to avoid nulls in arguments. 5. Initialize objects early. Initialize variables when declared to avoid nulls. 6. Handle exceptions. Use try-catch to handle NPEs when absolutely necessary, but prefer prevention. By following these practices, you can significantly reduce the likelihood of encountering null pointer exception in your Java applications and ensure your code is more resilient and easier to maintain. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with more Java tutorials and tech updates. See you in the next one, and happy coding!